And then, go on. Were you called a PR person, a corporate communications person?
Yeah, IBM calls the function communications.
Okay.
And in that, what would one recognize? You'd recognize media relations. Today it's external relations because it's media, analysts, and other influencers. But there's an external facing side of the function, and there's an internal facing side of the function, which turned out to be the lion's share of the people and the resource was IBM communicating to its own employee base, and crisis management and so forth. But roughly speaking, it's 2/3, I would say, of the function was, and I think it is still today, aimed at employees, and of course the relationship management with the outside world. So I came into an unusual part of IBM, which is the research divisions, the laboratories. One happens to be out in San Jose, where I'm raised, in San Jose State University. So I took my internship there, and then I became a regular employee in a 3-person communications department at this research laboratory. Normally that would be like a backwater in the company, but because it's one of a small number of our flagship research labs, it was fantastic because here I was fresh out of school, and for 5 years I was with this laboratory, and it was great. One, because it's basic research, it's not product development. Therefore, it's not all confidential. It's more like a university environment, and we were making news or trying to get coverage externally all over the world based on scientific breakthroughs and colorful scientists and all of that. And internally, we were a source of great stories for IBMers all over the world to read about. What was coming out of the laboratories of IBM. So I learned a tremendous amount about everything, the profession, as well as technology and the importance of corporate culture. And I was having a great time there. An unusual sidebar to my career happened during that 5-year period at the Almaden Research Center in San Jose. So like a lot of our laboratories in IBM, Almaden is multidisciplinary. So it has 600 or 800 scientists, but they all don't do one thing. So you have an arm over here doing computer science, you have another arm over here doing aspects of physical science, materials, chemistry, magnetism. Over here you have people at the time working on printer technologies and inks and things like that. You had a mathematics department. And like I said, it was very much like a university environment with many parts of the campus. Well, when you're part of a 3-person team covering all of that and trying to explain that to the outside world and to the inside world, one of the things you end up doing, of course, if you're effective, is you have to learn enough about every one of these disciplines, technologies, projects, to explain it, to make it accessible and understandable and relevant to people, which is just great learning and great fun, if you like that kind of thing, and I very much do. Well, one of the things that occurred or happened because of that, and I do think it's extremely valuable, is I ended up getting a patent.
I was going to ask you about that.
Oh, you knew about that?
Yes, I knew about the patent. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the patent came about because IBM, a sister laboratory in IBM, had a breakthrough invention called the scanning tunneling microscope. And it was the first invention or device in the world that could look at individual atoms on the surfaces of anything. Obviously, it's not an optical microscope, so in order to explain, and they won the Nobel Prize in 1986 for it. This is a group in Switzerland. But since it was the Nobel Prize, and it was such a exciting story because you could look at atoms, everybody wanted to know, how does this thing work? Because it's not an optical microscope. So I had to learn about how it worked, the principles, and I had to explain it over and over and over again. Well, it turns out that if you sort of reduce it, and I won't bore you with how the thing works, but when you really sort of explain or understand how this device works, and sort of divorce yourself from that it's being used as a device to look at atoms, if you kind of change it in some ways, could it not be used for something very different? And because I had the benefit of looking across disciplines, it turns out that in almost every scientific endeavor, there is a kind of holy grail search. Right? Everybody wants to have the unifying theory, or the smallest this, or the solve the problem that, or the whatever. And this team over here, which doesn't talk to this team over here, they're trying to solve or make computer chips more powerful and smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's kind of a scaling challenge. And they use all kinds of materials and lasers and all kinds of things. Well, the patent came about because I was talking to these scientists over here one day, and they said, hey, let me ask you a couple of questions. I drew the scanning microscope. I said, you see this device over here? It works on the basis of these principles, right? Yes, that's right. Well, if you change these, the voltages and the technology in these ways, would you not be able to use it not to look at atoms, but to move atoms? And if you were able to move atoms, you can then use it to build, extremely small features in computer chips. And they thought about it and said, there's no reason why it wouldn't work that way. And I was done. I was just very happy to sort of make those connections. And as I walked out of the room, they said, well, wait, come back here. What are you going to do with that? I said, nothing. I just wanted to know whether it would work. And they said, no, that's a novel idea, and you should file a patent for it. Which I have a PR degree from San Jose State University. They said, no, it's a novel idea. It will work. It's new thinking. And they assisted, and the lawyers got involved, and I got a patent. I think how it relates to what the course of one's career later, my career, was the value of lots of things. Multidisciplinary thinking, huge. And I've seen that over and over again. And it doesn't have to be in the sciences, right? It could be in the salespeople not talking to the product people, or the lawyers not talking to the HR people, or our people not talking to the finance people, or Europe not talking to Japan. And the more you're able to source different points of view and opinion, some things, sometimes insights occur and solutions occur that would not otherwise, be surfaced. So I learned that very early in my career, and so that, it was that. So 5 years in the research laboratory, 5 wonderful years of learning. But IBM, one of the jokes in the old IBM company, IBM stands for I've been moved. And as much as employees, joke about it, they get moved around a lot because the company believes in development of its people. And it believes in moving them from division to division or geography to geography, so you're always learning, which is a wonderful thing if you're up for it. But my wife, I just got married joined the company in '84, got married in '86, so we're newlyweds, and starts this pull to come to New York, because that's where the lion's share of communications jobs are today. We had no interest in ever moving from California. But the company kept at it, different job opportunities, and we finally accepted a 2-year assignment. Because if we didn't like New York, we wanted a way back. That was 1989. So after 5 years of doing this job in the research center, I was moved to corporate headquarters. And that was 1989. And I've been there ever since. So it's now my 25th year in IBM. When you talk to most IBMers who have been with the company for 25 years, and you say, well, how many jobs have you had? They'll say 23, 28. And if you say, well, how many managers have you had? They'd say, 18 to 30. For me, truly, I've worked in 2 parts of IBM, the laboratory and corporate, and I've worked for 5 people over 25 years. Kay Keeshan, wonderful manager who hired me, she was one of the 3. She managed 2 people out in California. A couple of executives in New York, and then Lou Gerstner and Sam Palmisano, Lou CEO, and Sam, my current boss. So I've had a very strange career, and I don't know whether it's been a good thing or not, but it's been the case. So I come to New York, I was in the internal communications department, with, again, this huge focus on employee communications. And I started writing for a couple of the flagship publications, print, that went to employees. One was a management publication. I don't know how many managers we had at that time, but to give you perspective, today we have about 42,000 managers, so it's within that range. So we had this management magazine. It aspired to be like an internal Harvard Business Review. It was, thinking on management. And then we had our flagship employee magazine called Think. And Think went all over the world. It was translated. It was a big, thick, glossy magazine. Came out 6 or 8 times a year. It's a great honor to be, kind of like a cub reporter on both of those. And came to corporate, started getting these writing assignments, and 89, 90. And after a year or two, after about a year, 18 months, the company started to talk to me about staying permanently in New York, which I was told was going to happen. We liked New York. A couple of mild winters, the company was doing great, seemingly, and we decided to stay. And the job that I was offered as a permanent position was in media relations, supporting the president of the company, not the CEO, but the president. And he was kind of the de facto chief technology officer named Jack Keeler. The reason why they sort of thought that would work for me is because of my background in the research division, not afraid of technology and so forth. And took that job, decided to stay in New York, still at corporate headquarters. But around about 91, 92, shortly after we decided to stay, the company went into a period of difficulty. Now, there was also a recession. This was the recession under the first President Bush, 91, 92, right? And like the recession right now, everyone suffers. So at first it looked like our financial difficulties and sort of slumping sales and slumping profits was due to the recession. But by well into 92, it was clear that while others were coming out of the recession, we were not only not coming out of it, but we were sliding even more severely into trouble. And at first people were very timid, people on the outside were very timid, the press, the analysts, to even suggest that IBM was in decline or in trouble, because the company had done so well for 70-something years. But after quarter after quarter after quarter of declines of one type or another, we started to get a lot of pressure and scrutiny about what was really happening at IBM. There are a lot of reasons why the company lost its way, and it's been written about, and I can certainly comment on that. But just to finish the narrative, the biggest decision that caused, I think, everything to start to unravel was the decision by the CEO at that time, John Akers, to abandon full employment. Now, you got a picture. Here's a company that was founded in 1911 by Tom Watson Sr. and had never laid off a single person in its entire history, despite the Great Depression, 2 world wars, recessions, but also a company that started off making clock scales and cheese slicers, and then went on to punch cards, vacuum tube calculators, manual typewriters, electric typewriters, photocopiers, electronic data processing equipment. And you can just imagine a company that has had to reinvent itself not once or twice or 5 times or 10 times. No company today could probably do that without having along the way to lose people, if for no other reason than your skill needs change.
Right.
But somehow IBM was able to do that as part of its business model and DNA and not lay off anybody in all that time. So the pressure inside the company for John not to be the CEO, to abandon full employment, was tremendous. By the way, Tom Watson Jr. was still alive. The Watsons never had a huge holding of IBM, but nevertheless, their shadow was very, loomed large over the company. But it could not be sustained. and John probably waited too long for very understandable reasons, but the pressure was building because we were losing money. By the time we started the first layoff or initiated the first layoff, we had already reported several quarters of losses. The stock was on the skids, cash flow problems, market share declines, all of that. So it was obvious that this was not sustainable, so we finally did it. So he began to lose the inside of the company too. So the outside world was beating up first on the company, then beating up on John. And then on the inside of the company, with not one layoff, but two, then three, closing of facilities, all of these things. And the whole time I'm at corporate headquarters, right? There's just like a never-ending series of setbacks and cuts and abandonment of one thing after another. So it felt like, and it was, in free fall. So John had one more master plan to, he had several, and because we are part of the corporate staff, I am. You always try to help the CEO, convey the plan, the strategy, and make people believe that it's going to work. In his case, it will work this time. And he had a plan to essentially split the company up and change the culture radically. And we put it out there, but it was too late. So in December of 1992, John announced that John Akers was stepping down. So, quarter of disappointing financials, quarter after quarter, IBM stock, bluest of the blue chips, lost, I can't remember the value, but it probably lost about 80% of its value, which was unbelievable. The bond rating we had AAA. The bond rating was dropped to one notch of junk. People did not know it at the time, but we were borrowing money to pay the dividend, which is a really bad idea to do. And there was talk in corporate headquarters that we wouldn't have enough cash flow to make payroll. This is unbelievable. I mean, maybe not these days, but for a reversal, it was a spectacular decline. And then to cork it, top it all off, to have your CEO basically be fired, I guess, was unbelievable. So let me just spend a minute on that day, which was preceded by a few things. So we're on a fiscal calendar, so we normally would announce fourth quarter results in January. But we had pre-announced results a few times because our disappointing financials, and usually when we put out a piece of news like that, it was accompanied with, therefore we're going to have more job cuts or factory closings or something. So we had another one of those in December of 1992. And whatever it was another round of cuts and another data point that we were still in free fall. The press, which had been really boring into the company and John himself for many months, now really smelled that something was going to happen at the top. For us, it was inconceivable that they could be right. It was just because there was no precedent for it. So we were, our jobs were, aside from trying to get people to believe in the turnaround plan, was to sort of fend off the speculation. To give you an idea of the scrutiny, the Wall Street Journal had 2 full-time reporters on the IBM beat. Yeah, we have one reporter today who covers like 15 technology companies, which is pretty normal, for a large company. But at that time, we had 2 reporters who got up every day, and all they did was cover IBM. Fortune and Business Week and everybody was covering this story. So the Fortune magazine, which by the way, the year that I joined IBM in 1984, the cover was the most respected company in the world survey. They started that survey in the 80s. IBM was the most respected company for 3 of the first 4 years, and we were always up in the top 5. That was 1984 when I joined. In 1992, they had a cover of dinosaurs, and they had 3, toy dinosaurs on the cover. The biggest one in the center had an IBM on its chest, and the two other dinosaurs were Sears and General Motors. Here we are in Chicago, and the Sears Tower isn't even the Sears Tower anymore, and we all know what's happened to General Motors. 84, 92, not very long, we went from most respected to example of everything had gone wrong in American business. But after that pre-announce in December of 1992, the New York Times the next day, on the front page, not the front page of the business section, but the front page of the newspaper, above the fold, which used to matter, the IBM era is over. And it was a brilliantly written, actually, very well reported story by John Markoff, good friend and a person who's covered technology for many, many years. And it was like the New York Times does when it observes the Cold War is over or it observes, something else. They just declared that our time had passed. We had ceded leadership of our industry to Microsoft and Intel and Apple and others, not just because of what happened the day before, but because it was the culmination of so many obvious things, that we were no longer leading the industry. That was the equivalent of an obituary for a company, because while we weren't Chapter 11, and we never did go into Chapter 11, we had something had been passed, right, to some other companies. So you can imagine in this period of time you have a narrative, external narrative, saying we were a failed company that had lost its way, become too bureaucratic, too arrogant, too many mistakes, too many missteps. Now zeroing in on John Akers, all the mistakes he made, not right for the job. Inside the company, we had abandoned full employment, so the employees were, afraid, angry, and here we are trying to communicate with everybody. So a few days after that New York Times story and the Fortune story and another pre-announce, all this stuff, there was a regularly scheduled board meeting. And we have two boardrooms then and today. One is in our corporate headquarters building in Armonk, New York, which is about 45 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. We've been there for many decades. We have a boardroom there. And then we have a large building in Manhattan, and we have a sister corporate floor there and a boardroom there. This board meeting happened to be in New York City. And I remember being on the floor with the other media reps. And this was going to be a pretty standard board meeting. The only thing we were expected to announce was some news on the dividend, either being reaffirmed or cut again or something. And it had already been written up. And we were just waiting for the board to formally approve it, and then we would get a phone call from the secretary saying, go ahead and put it out in the wires. Very standard. And the board meeting was supposed to be around 10 or 11 in the morning. So we're kind of standing around, and my colleague Rob Wilson, who had the beat for financial relations, was waiting for the call. Well, the call never came. And we waited and we waited and we waited, and nothing from the board or the secretary. So hours went by, and we kept checking, saying, well, no word, and the board is still in session. So it seems to me around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the board was supposed to be done like at 11 in the morning, right? Like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our boss comes in and says, just got a call from Mary Lee Turner, who was the vice president of communications at the time, reported to John directly. And she said that you, Rob, and I, the head of media relations, she's sending the helicopter to Armonk, where we were, and we are to go down to New York City because we have to help communicate something. So they all packed their stuff up, and we all looked at each other, and we didn't talk very much, but we feared the worst, and it was the worst, because the board had accepted John's resignation. The CFO was being terminated. He never returned, as far as we know, to the building, except maybe in the dead of night. My boss, or the executive I supported, the president, was becoming a vice chairman, but essentially stripped of his responsibilities. and the board was initiating, for the first time in our history, a search for a CEO, most likely from outside the company. So we were headless from that day until when our new CEO arrived. We were headless for about 2 or 3 months. For me, those were the roughest and most awful months, because what can you communicate? You can't say anything about your strategy. You can't say anything to your employees about what's going to happen. I can't even tell my wife whether I'm going to have a job, which was, a small consideration given everything else happening. And so everybody, your competitors, the press, the analysts, they can say whatever they want. And they did. So they destroyed poor John's reputation. Because think about it, the CEO, the CFO, and the president of the company were basically all sort of lopped off, and we have no head. The board can't talk about it. They're not going to talk about this search. So for 2-3 months, we were just sitting ducks. So things couldn't get much worse. During that period of time, there was enormous speculation, of course, of who would be selected to turn around IBM. In hindsight, there were some really laughable names that were suggested in the press, which I won't name, but looking at actually what kind of CEOs they turned out to be, they probably not up to the task. But the press, whether they were being fueled with just rumors or the headhunters, certainly I don't think leaks from the board, our board, but a list sort of started to coalesce around a list. And there were sort of the top 3, and then the next 5, and then sort of long shots, right? And of course, just sitting around like a normal human, you would start to have your own point of view and lots of water cooler gossip about who might lead IBM. What would it mean if that person got it or that person got it? By the way, as the board was doing its interviews and its own search, occasionally somebody who was on the list would sort of make a comment publicly that they weren't interested in the job. So either they were not actually interested in the job, or the board had sort of, not contacted them or whatever. So enormous handicapping was going on here. I remember I was in California back visiting my family, and I got a call from Rob, again, my colleague Rob, and he said, board's made its decision, we do the deed in an hour, announce. And you're not going to believe who it is. Who is it? So I started going down the list, right? Is it John Scully of Apple? Is it Bill Gates, which actually had been rumored? Is it this one? Is it that one? Is it this one? Nope, 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 nope. I think I was like down to number 12 or 13. I go, oh no, it's not this guy Gerstner. Lou Gerstner? Yep. Oh my goodness. I've never said, why even go back to New York? I mean, this man is coming to us from RGR Nabisco. This is the cookie man and the cigarette guy. And before that, he ran a part of American Express. No technology experience, never ran a big company, except for this kind of conglomerate thing. All consumer, not, and we weren't the only ones saying it. The press was saying, as they were handicapping each one. And then Rob says, well, that's not the worst of it. I said, well, what do you mean? He says, he's bringing his own communications leader. What happened to Mary Lee? She's out. We're working for this new guy already. We haven't even named Gerstner, and his guy's calling all the shots. He's telling us how we're going to announce it, what the press. He's writing the press release. And I'm like, who is this? This is David Callis. And what's he like? He's kind of strange, and he's in charge. Believe me, we're all working for him. So I hung up the phone. I'm like, we got this guy who has no experience in our industry, and we have a new functional leader. Wow. Well, I think everyone should know, I hope, about the turnaround that Lou Gerstner led. Remarkable. And the fact that his first personnel decision, his first hiring decision, was as head of communications, even before he even showed up for work. says a lot about how he felt and feels about communications. Everything changed. Everything changed. So Lou arrives on April 1st, 1993, and David Callis arrives with him. And David's his own person, you know. I mean, for people who know David, he's a very private man. He's very shy. He has a temper. Who doesn't? But the thing about David that I can now see very clearly, and we saw it very quickly, was that he was a pro. Up until then, the head of communications at IBM was never held by a professional communicator. It was held by executives who were being rotated through a corporate staff experience on their way to something else. Mary Lee Turner, who was the head of the function when I came to corporate, was actually a salesperson who was being groomed for something else. And then her predecessors, going back many, 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 it turns out that they were these other kinds of executives. The professionals of the function rose to be key lieutenants, but they never ran the function. Up until then, it seemed perfectly normal for that kind of an arrangement. But then we saw the difference when David arrived. David was a close advisor to Lou. David was obviously trusted by Lou. David took control of, he insisted on things that are so obvious, but we didn't have them. Message coordination, consistency, professionalism. Because one of the things that happened when IBM had full employment, well, we didn't let anybody go, but you also couldn't let anybody go. Excuse me. What happens is that you kind of dump people in certain parts of the business, right? You can't dump people into the research laboratory too easily. Salespeople have to sell. So it turns out that communications was one of the dumping grounds of IBM. You don't know it at the time. You don't like to think that. But in hindsight, it was full of people who weren't professionals and who didn't really choose to be there. Good people, really nice people, hardworking, but they really weren't experts at communications. So David really changed our function under Lou's leadership. And what were some of the things he did? Because John Akers, as his sort of Hail Mary strategy I mentioned earlier, was to kind of break the company up, not spin out units, but give the different parts of IBM more autonomy. If you just let the genie out of that bottle a little bit, because people want to do their own thing anyway, and John actively encouraged it for a while, a couple of years. Well, that meant that everybody was communicating and sending out messages and doing anything on, kind of as they saw fit. But it was a train wreck in terms of coordination and consistency and speaking with one voice. So David insisted that we start to coordinate our messages, which was very logical but hard to do. He insisted on people being accountable for the output of their work. And let me tell you a quick story about the coordination of messages. We announced Lou's executive compensation for coming to IBM the same day we announced a round of layoffs in a different part of the company. It was the lead item on the NBC Evening News with Tom Brokaw that night. The juxtaposition of Lou getting this compensation package for coming to IBM and this round of layoffs. The next morning, David declared that henceforth, nothing is being communicated to the outside world unless it's coordinated by a team in corporate headquarters. Secondly, he insisted that our press releases actually make news. Now, that sounds kind of obvious, but if I think back upon the work of media relations, prior to David's arrival, we celebrated the fact that we got a news release through the system, approved by everybody and the lawyers and everybody signed off on it, and that it got issued. Of course, we wanted to see whether we actually got any articles from it, but it was a kind of secondary consideration because we can't control the press, but we can control press releases and press events. So the culture of communications was very much oriented toward rewarding activity. One day, of course, all these press releases are streaming past David every day, and he had enough. So he, because he can't understand most of the press releases, they're just so poorly written. That's why we're not getting any news, right, for most of the things we're pumping out there. One day he just plucks one of these press releases out, and he says, where does this, he looks in the corner, for more information, contact so-and-so. Where does this person work? He goes, oh, a different building up the road. He goes, please give me the address. So he gets in his car and drives up to one of these big complexes that we have. He finds this person as, this big group of media relations reps cranking out these press releases. And he introduces himself to this person and says, can I ask you a couple of questions? He holds the press release up. Yes. So, let me read the headline to you. Reads the headline. What does this mean? And she's like, well, actually, IBM announces today the new product, XYZ, and it has this, kind of claim to it. The fastest throughput, scalable, best availability, whatever. What does this mean? And it became clear after stumbling around for a minute she didn't really know. Okay, well, that's fine. Let me read you the lead. And he reads this lead paragraph. What does that mean? She couldn't explain it. Because it quotes a mid-level executive. Do you think this quote is actually going to show up in the press anywhere? It was a typical canned quote. She said, probably not. David says, well, if you think this is understandable, actually not going to generate news, and the content's not going to show up in the press, why would you ever put your name on it? Of course, she was, devastated by this, and the word got out that David had, done this, quote, drive-by shooting. He only did it once, but people were, jolted into realizing, they may not have approved of his method, but they were jolted into realizing that we were confusing activity for results. Something I still use to this day, that term that David taught us. And, big companies suffer from this. Conference calls, meetings, checkpoints, coordination, running around, making PowerPoint presentations, all of this stuff. And at the end of the year or the end of the day, you say, what did I actually do? It, put into one column activity and put in another column outcome. We were way out of whack. So these were really basic things, but what they were all indicative of, and this was an eye-opener for me, is that we weren't professionals. We might have been professional IBMers, but we weren't professional communicators. So David insisted on it. We went on talent binge. We hired from the outside. We moved people around, took chances on people internally.
Where were you in this whole thing?
So I was still at corporate, as I am today. I was in media relations, still doing my thing, and kind of observing David, not in a harsh way, and he gets that rap, but he was just it's kind of funny that he was so surprised that this very, very, very large function of people weren't very skilled. And he was just trying to coordinate things, insist on results, quality, impact, all the things you would normally do. And so I was kind of, at first I was very unhappy about the fact that David was so critical, because here are these outsiders coming in, we're the IBM company, and he's just sort of passing judgment on that we don't know what we're doing. He never said that, but you could just tell by his behavior he didn't think much of us. But after a while, you realize, A, he's right, and B, he's teaching us things. So my career started to move from, I'm down now below David at least 3 levels as part of a media relations department. I'm not a manager even, I'm a rep and representative. One day, I got called to a meeting for the IBM annual report, which was the responsibility of an entire department of people. They didn't do investor relations. They didn't do anything except prepare for and execute the annual report, which today is the responsibility of like 1/2 of a person. I mean, in hindsight, again, a department of 5 people, what do they do for a whole year getting ready to do an annual report? But anyway, that was IBM then. Well, I got called to this meeting along with about 30 or 40 other people. We crammed into one of our conference rooms. And David was sitting there, and he says, I want to talk about the annual report. And I've invited some other people to, offer their views or just to sort of observe our discussion. And what happened was, we went around the table and, what is the theme of the annual report? People talked. What is the design going to be? People talk. What is the paper going to be? People talk. Different people talk. What is the distribution strategy? Different people talk. This is a giant committee. And he didn't say a word, but you could tell by his body language he thought this was not a good way to do it. So he started going around the room saying, well, what do you think? What do you think the theme should be? And we were all very respectful of each other, so people would say, well, I agree. No, I'm not asking you to comment on what do you think, Oh, I think this, okay. Well, I'm sitting there and he comes around to me and says, whatever the question was, what do you think? And I offered a point of view. It wasn't critical of my colleagues, but I said, well, actually, I think, this is a time for IBM to say this kind of thing or whatever it was. It was okay. He thanked everybody and left the room. So we went back to our offices. I called out the other media relations people, and I was laughing and laughing, saying, the annual report team is doomed. It's doomed. This guy, David, is so unhappy with this big committee. We're all talking over each other. There's no consistency. It's a big bureaucracy. They're in trouble. Laughing. Like half an hour later, David, who never comes down to that part of the building, comes over and does that with his finger. And I go into my office, and he sits in front of me, puts his big size 12 shoes on my desk and says, I'd never met him face to face. And he says, I hear you're the technology guy. I said, well, that's part of my responsibility. You understand this stuff? I said, well, I'm not afraid of it. I like it. I enjoy learning about it. What did you think of that annual report meeting? I said, well, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces. I agree. Nothing great comes out of a committee. I've disbanded the committee. Oh, okay. You're in charge. I'm like, what does that mean? You're in charge. Great things come from vision and leadership. I like what you said in the meeting. You're in charge. Congratulations. He got up and left. So I kind of stagger out in the hall. And by the way, as soon as he leaves, all the other people come out. What was that about? So I tell him this. Well, what does that mean? No, I don't know. He meant it when he meant it. He just said, from now on, you're in charge. And I had to, I guess that meant that the 5-person department was going to report to me. They didn't know what it meant either. But I said, okay, let me try. So we put out a miserable annual report, but the next year it got better and so forth. So David said, all right, that was pretty good. That was certainly a lot better than what it was going to be. And my recollection is, now that I see what David's pattern was, he liked to sort of try people out. Sometimes they were little assignments, just questions he'd ask. He rarely formally announced a reorganization. He would first sort of test somebody out, and then it was kind of obvious where things were going to go. So I ended up being in charge of the annual report, in addition to my little media relations beat area. And then the speechwriters were having a very hard time connecting with Gerstner. And since I was interfacing with Gerstner a lot with the annual report, given that it's his document, David eventually said, you're now responsible for the speechwriting staff. So I picked up the speechwriting staff. And then if I fast forward, I don't know, months later, quarters later, he declared that internal communications was not working out well, and he said, you try it. And I ended up being responsible for internal communications. And if I fast forward, probably 4 or 5 years, he ended up having essentially 2 direct reports. Rob, for media relations, which is the only thing Rob had great passion for, and he was fantastic at it. And I had other, which was speech writing, annual reports, internal communications, and so forth. And that's how he chose to, evolve the function and find people. Now, what he says, he's since retired, of course, and Lou had the company under his control for 9 years. And David believes in certain things that I now believe in. He believes in activity, not results. He believes in organizing around talent. So you don't know how to organize unless you can size up the talent you've got. And one of the things I learned from David, which I practice today, is you can come up with a perfect organization chart, but if you don't have talent and the people who can actually make that work, what's the point? It's better to surround yourself with as much talent as you can get, find out what people can do, want to do, and then keep changing the organization around people's strengths and their aspirations, and keep everybody learning. So at any given time, David's organization never made a lot of sense. It wasn't symmetrical, it wasn't necessarily logical. And my organization is very similar. It drives HR crazy because I don't have very neat boxes. But it makes for a very effective and diverse organization.